buzz around the room, yes, it is extremely important. But before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that all of us here are in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral land of the Mi'kmaq people. It is my duty as a citizen to better understand the historical impacts of colonization in this country and how those impacts continue to affect First People of this territory today. We are reminded that territories are rooted in peace and friendship, and they were signed which binds to bind us all as treaty people with the rights and responsibility to each other. In order to accept my role in reconciliation and acknowledge this territory, it has to have meaning for me, and I must first understand the truth of our shared history. I'd also like to acknowledge that for over 400 years, African Nova Scotian communities have been significantly impacting and shaping the cultural, economic, and education and artistic landscape of our province. As we approach African Heritage Month, which kicks off on the 1st of February, but I do know that it has already started in some regard, I'd like you to keep in mind and keep an eye out for events that's going on in your community and participate and support those events. It's also the Lunar Year for all those who are celebrating at this time. So now it is my pleasure to welcome Patrick Sullivan, President and CEO of the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. Patrick?
Thank you very much, Anne, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. Certainly get rid of the little light we've got right here. Well, this is going to be an interesting discussion. It may seem surprising to you, but President Trump was only installed 9 days ago. There's already been quite a flurry of activity and obviously a flurry of executive orders. Thankfully, there were no immediate tariffs placed on Canadian goods to the U.S. There was, however, a broad trade memorandum ordering federal agencies to complete comprehensive reviews of a range of trade issues by April 1st. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw that order. April 1st was a ways away, and then listened to the interviews that evening, and unfortunately February 1st popped up. So the president has said he may implement tariffs by February 1st rather than waiting for the April 1st review. Sadly, all of this is confusing, worrying, frustrating, and upsetting. As our neighboring country and largest trading partner, the economic implications of a 25% U.S. tariff could be significant both to the Canadian and the Nova Scotian economy. We at the Chamber are taking a positive view that there will be solid discussions between willing partners to ensure that many of these concerns don't happen. But we're not naive. We are reflecting on similar issues during the previous Trump administration around steel and aluminum that were eventually resolved with a new Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement that was signed in 2018. The premiers and the federal government meet regularly, and we're told there's a plan for escalating tariffs from Canada to convince the US that a tariff trade war is in no one's interest, whether they be US citizens who will pay more for Canadian goods or Canadian workers who will see less demand for the goods they export. The Nova Scotia Chambers had a very positive meeting with Premier Houston, Minister LeBlanc, and Minister Lohr last week. We discussed tariffs, the current situation, and what we could do to offset any pending impact. One opportunity discussed by the premiers, Ottawa, and the chambers included lowering or removing some of the interprovincial trade barriers that we now face. An IMF report originally done in 2015 but released in 2018, estimated that removing interprovincial trade barriers would be the equivalent of a 21% tariff reduction. So you can see that interprovincial trade is already frustrating business in Canada. The Chamber has long been in favor of removing interprovincial trade barriers and is ready to advocate for this change. Today, we're joined by some special guests from different backgrounds who can talk about these tariffs and their implications for the province and the country. We're going to hear from a few of our speakers, one of whom is joining virtually, and then we'll all gather on stage to discuss further and answer questions. First up, please join me in welcoming Robert Huish, Associate Professor, Department of International Development Studies, Dalhousie University. Robert, up to you.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for such a warm welcome. My job speaking is like never to bring good news, so I might as well dive right into it. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I'm going to try to be very brief, and hopefully we can get more of your questions going in a minute. But let's begin. So the imposition of trade wars, tariffs, is coming right at us hard and quick within just a few hours. Now, I'm not an economist, and I know very, very little about commerce, possibly dangerously little about commerce. But what I do spend my time is looking at political systems and maybe history too. So I want to share some points with you just to sort of kick things off here. Now, traditionally with U.S.-Canada relations, usually when a president comes into power, the first thing that they do is they visit Canada, right? That's usually been the rule. So we had, Reagan come up and visited Trudeau. You had Bill Clinton and Chrétien. They really, really got on like a house on fire. Obama came up and, got some cookies and beaver tails, all that kind of thing. And usually, and even George Bush, he had a good time up here too.
No evidence of that.
I frankly felt like the reception we received on the way in from the airport was very warm and hospitable. And I want to thank the Canadian people who came out to wave with all 5 fingers for their hospitality.
It's amazing what 2 decades can do, eh? Just it makes it look like, oh, Bush is so novel and cute now. We're not going to see that kind of reception with Trump. Trump, even just before coming into his second term, his opening greeting to Canada was to start to paint our map this way, right? Very bombastic, very offensive, very ham-fisted in every single regard. And before we even sort of understand why there's this discussion of 25% tariffs coming in, it's worth rolling back to understand some of the political architecture that is taking place right now. Some of it is laughable. Could this ever happen? Could Canada become a 51st state? Simply no, it can't, right? There's just, that's not in the cards. But what we can see is that within this language, there are some political mechanisms, both in the Executive House and within Congress, that can make life very, very difficult, not just for trade and commerce, but for business, for politics as usual, and of course, for the very deep interpersonal relations that Canadians have with the Americans, okay? I stand up here today, citizen of Canada, resident of Hubbard's, Nova Scotia. I've also got an American green card here in my pocket, and an ID as an active firefighter in South New Jersey in Cape May County, right? And it's mind-blowing, like we're discussing around our own dinner table about how we're going to get through this going forward. But no kidding that with the 25% tariffs coming up, a lot of people do research in the area say that this is absolutely mind-blowing. It's madness, right? In The Economist, if you are a reader of The Economist, you would have seen that they made this quote here. It's hardly necessary to say that with a legislation of this kind, we have no sympathy whatsoever. In our view, it is as mistaken as it is certain to prove mischievous. That's The Economist. Did anyone catch that? No, you didn't, because it wasn't written in 2025, it was written in 1890, right? And that's something to pay attention to, right? We see that Mr. Trump is one that really doesn't like dealing with reason or rationality in any regard. The 2018 treaty, right? There his signature, right? That's on it. And now he's saying that this is a disastrous deal. What The Economist is writing about was actually the time of William McKinley, whose Mount Denali is now being renamed, according to the United States and to Google Maps. McKinley had two objectives and two things that he was really staunch about. One was American annexationism of other territories and also of tariffs, two things that he supported and then once he stepped out of the office, deeply regretted. It's something that I wrote about earlier this month, and we talked about basically how annexation works in the United States, right? The idea historically has been that the U.S. Constitution actually has clauses in the second article, the second act of the second article, the second act, actually has an architecture in place for the executive branch to come forward with a treaty, pass a treaty through Congress at a 2/3 majority, and then suddenly either through cession, subjugation, or purchase, the other territory becomes part of the United States. So as much as we're talking about this tariffs today, Greenland right now is in the crosshairs of a very serious discussion about joining the United States for purchase. And that again is a historical argument from the 19th century. The Whig paper in Washington after the Treaty of Hidalgo, which saw how many states joined the United States during that time from Mexico in February of 1847 for purchasing $15 million. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo basically brought in most of the western United States all the way up to Oregon. It was at the result of a war, 4 years of conflict, that ended with a cession, a purchase. So thereby the United States taking nothing by conquest, thank God, as I wrote in the paper. Now, if you listen very carefully to some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Mr. Trump today, you're seeing a lot of similarities to that era of McKinley, where, you know, it was railroad barons, it was expansionism, it was annexation. And Trump has already been dropping the terms manifest destiny, right? Very much wanting to expand U.S. influence, not through rules-based order, but through expressions of strength, right? The manifest destiny all the way to Mars, I suppose, basically mimicking that kind of railroad baron mentality there, but again, tuning it right up to Mars today. AI art is a very special genre, I just have to say. But we're seeing this kind of discussion. The convention, business as usual, international norms, they're going to be toast for the next 4 years, because if it's a February 1st deadline, an April 1st deadline, there will be something else coming up within 6 months after that. So the idea of engaging with the United States through reason and rationality is deeply, deeply jeopardized, to the point that Americans should really consider what their role is in the world. Since 1949, the U.S. has been, quote unquote, that benign superpower, there to guard things like democracy and freedom and to open up markets and this sort of thing around the world. This is now directly in the crosshairs, so to speak. So tariffs, threats to border closures, slander, even threats to annexation. I mean, where do we begin to understand that? You actually see, if you look at the history of politics, if you look at the history of history, you see that none of this is new. This is actually something that goes back to the ancient Greeks. I mean, take my buddy Eli Diamond's class in classics at Dalhousie. Fantastic professor, blows your hair right off when you're in his class. He talks about Plato, right? And basically, what's the greatest threat to democracy is a progression of societies themselves. Societies start off as aristocracies, then to democracies, militaries control the situation, oligarchies, the wealthy control, democracies is reverting power to the people, as Plato said, but then it becomes so complicated, so hybrid, so many different variables that society can't really understand it, and they start to invest their confusion into that of a tyrant. And so we see that democracies will ultimately manifest themselves into tyrannies over time, according to Plato. And historically, democracies have been some of the shortest lived experiences of any form of governance. The thing is now that the U.S. is always prided itself on democracy at home and in spreading democracy abroad. We have to be really careful with a leader in the executive branch that may be having these blustery tantrums to the public, but actually has some architecture behind him to reassert power into the executive office or to put international pressures quickly through Congress. We see that the way that if it's treaties or if it's annexation, there are mechanisms in Congress for both. For tariffs, what we see is that in order to justify it in the US today, it has to be declared as some sort of emergency to security or to the economy. So as we're trying to look at our murky crystal balls going forward, we have to ask ourselves, in what way is our sector, is our country being presented as some sort of economic or security risk to the United States? Because it's the only way you can actually pass these things through Congress today. But don't forget, I mean, the U.S. itself, the Constitution is deeply annexationist. It's something where the last 50 states were joined after World War II, and a lot of people do forget that there are 15 overseas territories around the world that were all under U.S. control through cession, subjugation, or purchase. Final things I just want to say, though, is that while we're looking at the U.S. internationally, it's no picnic right now inside. The memorandum that came through the other day, a direct intimidation tactic that was sent out to 2 million federal employees to say, resign now, right? Basically using everything but the letterhead that Elon Musk did when he asked everyone on Twitter to resign. I mean, it was the greatest thing of plagiarism that's probably ever come out of that executive office. But that's a warning shot, because when you see democracies themselves be compromised, and this pressure towards tyranny, the idea is that everybody feels some sort of pressure. Canada, Nova Scotia, we're not solo in this. This pressure is being felt by Americans themselves, other countries around the world. Once the pressure, once the bluster, once the fear comes into it, and the negotiation starts, usually the request is some form of loyalty along the way. Now, what do we actually expect? What's actually being asked for the tariffs on Canada? Well, we've seen requests to tighten our border and our visa requirements. We've seen something about the idea of increasing our military presence in the Arctic and in NATO. And we've seen discussions of eliminating a trade deficit, which is sort of around the 50 billion-ish mark, although Trump pops numbers out daily that do not resonate at all. So that last one's really, really hard to deal with. In dealing with the US in this regard, what are some of the things and what are some of the risks involved with each request for tightening the border? Is it possible that the US Border Services could have a stronger presence in Canada, in the Canadian border ports, with the expectation that Canada would pay for it? Is that something? Can we expect more US presence in the country? And for that trade deficit down here, is it something that can be cured in their imagination by tariffs? We just don't know. But beyond our borders is something to remember as well, to keep an international focus here, because as much as we're going to feel the hurt and the fear from Washington, we also have to remember that others are in the same boat. The belligerent threats that are being made right now, there's Donald Trump Jr. trying to buy Greenland, the belligerent threats to traditional US allies. That's not how a rules-based order of governance works at all. The real desire for territorial expansion. This is not a joke. This has really been put forward, and like a toddler having a tantrum, if you have something dangerous behind you, like constitutional acts, it could get to this discussion. Total retraction of diplomacy, development and aid. The State Department just had all its funding frozen, showing that there's very little interest to learn from others around the world. And that's my own field in international development. You get the best knowledge of your neighbors, friends, allies, and enemies through cooperation in international development. And also a drastic de-investment in domestic programs, including federal support for things like Medicaid. Now, I just raise all that going forward, as we're dealing with this new era, we have to remember that it's not just about us. We are part of a bigger project of disrupting this global order. And it's one where the end goal is to try to demonstrate order through projecting American strength. And that is something that we have not seen encouraged in most of the 20th century. It really does revert us back to the 19th century. So in terms of politics and in terms of economic decisions that are being made in Washington, that Make America Great era, it doesn't start with Reagan, it starts with William McKinley. And that's, I think all of us need to do very well to understand the architecture and the history that Washington's working with right now. So, as I promised, I don't deliver good news. And I'll turn it over to Patrick. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bob. I think we're actually having a little trouble connecting to Pierre. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get Bob. Sorry, you just went down, but I'm going to get you and JP to come up, and we're going to start with some of our questions, and then as we connect, we will let Pierre do his thing. Okay. So I'll ask you two to come on up. Middle, here, middle. Okay, there we go. I think we've got our microphones on. I'm just going to keep my phone here to kind of see what's going on. So thanks very much, Bob. I really appreciate that. You did say that you weren't going to be full of good news, and you clearly weren't. So I'm going to just kind of try to have a breath of fresh air and go to JP. JP DeVoe is the CEO of Acadian Sea Plants, and I think many of you in the room know him. But I'll start with a question for you, JP, if that's okay. So, from your perspective, what are some of the direct and indirect costs or risks for businesses operating in a cross-border market? Maybe your business, for instance.
Well, Patrick, look, thanks for that question. But before I get into what you are asking me here, I just want to comment, Robert, on your opening slide there that you had, which had that deck of cards, and you had, I thought it was kind of a nice analogy here, but I think you made one mistake because you had him as the king of something, and he should be the joker in the deck.
Yeah, I didn't
mean,
get that deck of cards, but I agree. with
yeah,
you.
so I
Yeah.
honestly, I think that really reflects what we're seeing out there. But if I go back, Patrick, to your question in here, and I think it was about a week ago, I was asked to come and sit on this panel here, and of course, you like to get ready because you want to be able to talk intelligently about situation, and we don't have a clue what the situation really is, and that's the really tough part, because in business likes to have some kind of certainty about putting together a plan. So you want to put together a plan, you want to execute your plan, you're going to deviate from your plan, and then you're going to put a plan together to get back on track to your plan. I mean, that's what you do. But you need to understand the environment that you're working in. And right now, we don't have a clue what's going to happen on February the 1st or April the 1st or anything like that. And it really doesn't matter what Donald Trump, President Trump, I guess he is now, is saying. It's going to be what he does, right? Because he wants to destabilize everybody, and certainly it works because you can see all the different types of things that he's talking about in here. But let's go to the indirect costs that you asked in terms of what are the indirect costs of business in here. And I think it's really important because Canadian manufacturers and exporters in December went and polled their membership, and they had about 300 people, 300 companies that responded to the request about what is it that you're doing, what are you thinking, what's happening out there. And the people said, about 25% of them said, you know what, I'm not going to hire people right now, okay? I'm also going to pull back on my capital investment. That's before anything's really happened. So that's what people are doing. There's this uncertainty that is going to have an impact on our economy in here. The other thing they asked is if they put in a 25%, if Donald Trump puts in a 25% tariff in there, what will you do? And that number jumped from 25% of the respondents saying that they were not going to hire anybody to 50%. So 50% of industry out there polled across the country said, we're not going to hire anymore, and we're also going to cut back on our capital investments. So this is the kind of mood and uncertainty that's that is really being created by the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of there. And so we're just going to have to see and watch what happens in there. But that's really bad from an economic point of view from a Canadian economy.
Well, I think so why is Trump picking on us? I mean, and you mentioned Greenland. Is it just us? Like, is it something we did?
Yeah, we're just too kind. No, the opening slides of the presidents coming to visit Canada is usually their first foreign visit was very intentional, right? That's usually where they stretch their legs.
to see how Air Force One deals, how the Secret Service can behave overseas, make sure all that infrastructure works to protect the president abroad. So Canada's usually the opening act, as has been definitely in the 80s, if not a little bit before. Same deal when it comes to tariffs. Let's use Canada as a sounding board for a bigger global agenda, right? Colombia was just right in the crosshairs of 25% tariffs this week. India is facing it. China's got 40 coming its way. Anyone in Latin America who opens their mouth right now is going to be subject to something, right? And so the idea that we can see this threat coming our way is really the sounding board. Like you said, the study about the impacts of tariffs will be coming out April 1st. What can we likely expect if anything drops on February 1st? Again, crystal ball, I do not give good advice, but what it could likely see is something that has been previously in the crosshairs of sanctions. Dairy, softwood, that kind of stuff that doesn't necessarily have a deep impact into the US, or it could go the other way, looking at things that are more considered like luxury goods or non-essentials. So things that aren't energy, things that aren't automobile parts, because those would require massive pivots and so that would impact the US society. So in many ways, that's the practicality of it. The other thing is that, again, back to that global scale, Mr. Trump really, really admires the strongmen, right? How many trips did he take to North Korea? 3? Or to meet Kim Jong-un, right? A couple in Singapore and actually went to the DMZ. Putin, he said very fond things over, right? And we see this repeated and repeated. And this expectation that first show of strength is to your ally, your closest ally, before you get into some of the more tougher stuff down the road, is in fact another sounding board.
You continue to be full of good news.
I'm only here for a couple hours.
Okay, all right, okay. JP, back to you. So, I mean, is there something in this time of uncertainty? Is there something that, and I'm not asking you to speak for all businesses, but I bet you've talked to other folks about what they're thinking about, or certainly what your business is thinking about. You have facilities in other locations. They may not be subject to the tariffs if Canada gets tariffs. Again, I'm trying not to be too detailed, but are you thinking about redirecting some of that manufacturing or production, or can you even do that? And do you think other folks are doing the same thing?
Well, if I use the example of our company, and we're kind of in a fortunate position. First of all, we're only got about 20% of our exports that goes into the United States. Well, we also have manufacturing facilities, we have 4 that make the identical product. 2 of them are located
I see the event.
One of them is in Ireland and one of them is in Scotland. So instead of taking the stuff that we would normally ship from Canada into the United States,
So
we can then
you're calling for the Halifax event.
Canadian stuff and send it to Europe, and then take the European stuff and send it to the States. Now, there's a cost associated with that.
I mean, I can see the podium.
We can do this. Allows us to be able to go and mitigate the effects of the tariffs in there. Not everybody has that kind of flexibility.
Okay, and I can hear them.
Now, one thing I do want to comment on is, well, like, why did President Trump not slap on these tariffs right away? Like, what is holding him back? And I think, as much as President Trump thinks that he can do anything he wants,
Yes, I'm ready to go.
Get away with it. The effect of putting on
Thanks.
these massive tariffs, if you do it at 25% across the board tariff on everything that goes from Canada into the United States, is going to be paid by the American consumer. Okay, so they will see that the prices of the goods that will come out of Canada will go up. Now you might say, okay, well, let's substitute those particular products. You can't do that overnight. You can put a tariff on overnight, but you can't substitute the products. And a couple of great examples is the oil industry, for example, is one. 50% of the imports of oil into the United States comes out of Canada. So overnight, if you're going to slap that 25% tariff on there, right, it can't just say, well, we'll just pull the oil from somewhere else. You can't do that quickly. Where are you going to get it from? Venezuela? Okay, is that going to be your favorite partner from now on? I mean, that's the kind of reality that you're sitting in there. So there's a lot of people that voted for Donald Trump this time around because they perceived that they're worse off during the Biden administration because of inflation. Now, inflation was generated a lot from COVID type reactions. It really wasn't much, it wasn't the Biden administration that created that inflation there, but they said, I was better off before under Donald Trump. I'm not as good now. Donald Trump, I vote for him again, bring him back in here. But if he puts on that kind of tariffs and if you put a 60% tariff on Chinese, all the Chinese stuff that's coming into every Walmart all across the United States, watch what happens to the consumer's pocketbook. They're going to say, wait a second, I'm supposed to be better off. They will not be better off. So that is something that is really holding him back, because he'll say, oh, no, we can absorb this. But the reality is that is a huge, huge issue for the American consumer.
So you've led us right to Pierre. So Pierre, can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great.
Sorry I'm late.
That's okay. I think you're on the screen now. Good to see you. I'll turn it over to you to give some presentation, and we'll just sit up here and be comfortable.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. The presentation is about what we expect for the economy in the next 12 months. You should see my screen by now. I don't know if you see it.
We've got it.
So, okay, perfect. So, so basically, the title is Growth Despite Everything, and I think everybody will relate to that. Despite the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy because of the tariff, and I was listening what you were saying before, we believe the Canadian economy will experience some growth this year. And the reason is lower interest rate that we have been seeing over the last 6 months will stimulate the economy. So this is a bit what I'm going to show in the next 10 minutes. So first of all, I know it's hard to believe when you watch the news, but there's some good news in the Canadian economy. And the first one is the fact that we are at the end of this period of higher interest rate. Interest rate has been increasing for the last 2 years to fight inflation. And as you can see from the graph, the Canadian economy has really slowed down as people pay more for their mortgages, for their car loans. They didn't have as much money for consumption. So consumption went down. Clothing consumption, for example, dropped by 9%. And so people had to make choices. But we are at the end of this period. And by the way, we didn't have a recession. Yes, the economy slowed down. We had 1% growth at one point, but we didn't have a recession. Second good news is inflation is going down. So from 8.1%, we are at 1.8%. And inflation has been close to 2% for the last few months. So we're back to price stability, which is an important point for businesses and for consumers. When inflation was around 8%, it was very hard to manage a business. We didn't know, how much we're going to pay next month or in the next 6 months. So price stability is back in Canada. And this is also a good news because it allows the Bank of Canada to reduce interest rate. So the Bank of Canada has reduced significantly its policy rate over the last 6 months. Again, yesterday, they reduced it. So now the policy rate is 3%, and we believe the Bank of Canada will continue to reduce the rate. And that will help the Canadian economy. But of course, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's basically two clouds that we see over the Canadian economy. The first one is the lower immigration target that the Canadian government has set in the fall. They want to reduce the non-permanent resident by 500,000 this year, another 500,000 next year. So this will limit the growth of the Canadian economy. And of course, a topic of our discussion today is the threat of the tariff. And we don't know how much sectors are going to be affected. We don't know how much tariff will be, but already we can see that the uncertainty around the tariff is already slowing down the Canadian economy. And the transmission channel is by business investment. Business investment are lower, and business investment intention are also lower. So this will have a negative impact on the Canadian economy. So what should we expect in the next 12 months? Well, the first, lower interest rate will stimulate consumption. We already see that. The last number we have for 2024, lower interest rate at the end of the year already is starting to have a positive impact on consumption. The latest survey from the Bank of Canada on consumers showing that Canadians are saying they're going to spend more this year than last year because they have more money to spend because of lower interest rate. And what makes us optimistic about this is the disposable income of Canadian has been increasing. Job market is tight, salaries have been increasing, the job market is still good. So people have more income and they will spend less on interest rates, so they will have more money to spend. And on top of it, savings are quite high in Canada. They have remained high after the pandemic. Canadians have $123 billion in their bank account. So there's money there. If they are confident about the economy, part of this money is going to be spent. Another sector that is benefiting from lower interest rate is the housing market. We are starting to see more sales across the country. We'll see more housing starts. This is the most sensitive sector to interest rates, so a lower interest rate will stimulate that sector. So that's the positive side, and consumption housing market will be the driver of the Canadian economy this year. But of course, business investment are low, and they will remain low. According to our research, a lot of businesses are cautious, rightly so. They're waiting to see what will happen. So this will be a drag on the Canadian economy. And our export that has been performing very well over the last few years. Again, this is a big unknown. With the tariff, we don't know how much export will be affected. So in conclusion, that gives us an expectation or a forecast of 1.5% growth, which is not great growth, below the potential growth of the Canadian economy, but at the same time, it's better than last year. So the main driver will be lower interest rate on the consumption side. However, unfortunately, the uncertainty created by the election of Mr. Trump is going to limit growth this year, and especially on the business investment side and probably on the export side. So basically, this is a very short summary, but I think it shows what we see right now at this point of time with the information we have. That's basically what we see the economy performing in the next 12 months.
Okay. Well, thankfully, Robert, we just got some good news compared to the news you've been giving us earlier.
You want me to bring it down again?
That's no. So we'll ask Pierre some more questions because his answers are more positive. So let's stick with you, Pierre, for a moment, and I'm going to jump to the USMCA. So the agreement that currently exists between Canada and the U.S. Do you think that will what role could that play in shaping tariffs, and what impact could we see, even though we have the USMCA? If that's a good question for you.
I think Mr. Trump, what he's looking for is to renegotiate the free trade agreement, and I think I don't think they will impose a lot of tariff on Canada, but they will impose tariff on some sectors, and that's basically a tool of negotiation, a little bit like he did it during his first mandate. If we remember well, he introduced 2 tariffs that he left after when we signed the new free trade agreement. I think the negotiation this time is going to be tougher than last time. Last time, that didn't change much for Canada, a little bit more for Mexico. This time around, I think Mr. Trump is looking for more requests from Canada. So I think the negotiation will be a bit more difficult.
Okay. Bob, back to you. So, to what extent have tariffs on Canadian products influenced U.S.-Canada diplomatic relations, or could they? And does he care?
They definitely will. Again, depending on what sectors get targeted. The last time that Canada was sort of being influenced, if it was, through tariffs or disruptions, we've seen other governments do that in the past. China has pulled that a few times. And it's very, there's some geopolitics that are very strategic. Where as opposed to, like you say, just blanketing the whole economy, you put strategic regional pressures on that then sort of percolate their way up to Ottawa, and then the federal government responds. So seafood here, of course, pork industries and Quebec and Manitoba, the automobile parts in the States, canola in the prairies, softwood, that kind of thing. So whatever's going to happen here between Canada and the US and trying to get through that, our political leaders need to really think about where they're bringing those conversations to. What point do you get that conversation going on the US side? Is heading to Mar-a-Lago the best idea? No, right? It's sort of fanning the flames, right? The important thing is to look at what these tariff threats are coming forward to. What specific constitutional act are they being tied to, right? If it's Canadian dairy coming up in a couple of days, is that being seen as an economic threat to the US or a security threat to the US? Like, what legislation is he going to try to tie this to? And at that point, do we have more discussions with the state level, gubernatorial leaders, governors, senior senators, people who've got still some reason within their political careers, because we're seeing the executive office just throw reason out the door, and not just for our international relations, but also how these orders are starting to come domestically. I mean, I can't get past the hubris of just asking 2 million people to resign and then threatening Medicare, for God's sakes, right? And this is in a country where 1 in 2 bankruptcies is due to medical care costs, right? It's shocking. So I do think that there's going to be enough people in the US that don't want to lose their livelihoods. They don't want to see business relations with Canada degrade, but it's going to be coming under a chorus of nonsense that will come out of the executive. And so our leaders need to be really strategic about that. Maybe, don't tweet at Trump and ignite him. Find the state that industry is doing the most business with, find that governor, and find those relations that we have cross-border. The one thing that's going to get us through this is that commitment to stability, which Canadian business has been very good at in maintaining that, and reason, right? Just simple reason that people shouldn't be just ham-fistedly moved out of an industry or sent to the unemployment line.
Right.
Patrick, if you,
Yeah, please.
if it's okay, if I can just add on to that. You talked about, what kind of retaliation we should have, and you talked about specifically going after certain states. I mean, when you look at this, you have a bully that's in the White House, right? And if you look at, when we were all young, there was always a bully in school. Okay, if that bully came in and decided they were going to have half your lunch and you let him have half your lunch, the next day, the bully's going to take half your lunch. And the third day, if he's really hungry, he's going to take your whole lunch if that's what you're going to let him do. So you have that behavior there. The only thing that we can do is to hit back extremely hard. It has to be painful. And it has to be painful to those states with a Republican governor that are exporting heavily into Canada. So that you hit those, and we don't have to be across the board or anything. We can go and say, let's point to those things, all right, and then really whack them as hard as we can. If we get hit with these things, that will be painful for Canada. It will drive us into a recession. But it's the only way that you're going to be able to deal with an individual like that. Because if we don't do that, the next day, we're going to lose our whole lunch. And that's going to keep on going, because that's the only thing that man understands.
The only thing I'd tack on to that, I'm not disagreeing with you at all on that method, but the bully who's stealing the lunch, why is he stealing lunch in the first spot? Well, maybe he didn't get a lunch at home. And it brings that up because when you actually spend time in the States, you see that there's a lot of things, not at the federal level, but at the state and the county level, that are absolutely hollow as a gourd, right? And this is something not that we maybe have a response for, but should think about some of those upstream things within the US that's pushing people to bullyism or to support it in that way. Again, healthcare costs. You can't get over this. It's 1 in 2 bankruptcies in the US is healthcare costs. Something like 40% of that is the big C word. Someone gets a cancer diagnosis, that's it, right? It's already moving in that direction. You look at other things that are frustrating within American society, or just right criminal. You know, there's the amount of gun violence. There's maternal health rates in U.S. Maternal mortality in the U.S. right now is 22 per thousand. In Canada, it's 8, right? The United States is the only G7 country where health indicators are decreasing, right? Infant mortality in the United States is 5.2 per thousand, okay? In Canada, it's 4.3, right? The only one where all of this is getting worse. And so as much as, you know, we could sit there and go, haha, it's also important to realize that a lot of the people that threw their trust into Trump are on the front lines of facing that kind of reality every day. And while we deliver a tough response, we also need to think about the upstream. What has led American society into such a desperate spot where everything seems so vulnerable? If it's healthcare, if it's long-term retirement, economic security, insurance companies letting houses just go, right? It's wild, and Americans are frustrated, and they've invested their frustration in a tyrant.
So those are great rational arguments. I don't know if rationality is the word of the day, but we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. Pierre, I want to come to you again and kind of talk about some specific sectors. I mean, we don't know which areas that the U.S. might particularly pick on at this point, but are there sectors of the Canadian economy that could be hit the hardest by tariffs if implemented, and will this push Canada into a recession, or could it?
To push Canada into recession, tariff will have to be on every export. That's what if it's only limited to some sectors, although it will be difficult for those sectors, but it won't lead to a recession. In all the scenario we have modelized for the Canadian economy, 25% tariff on everything will lead to a recession, especially if Canada retaliate, because that will have a negative impact on the Canadian economy as well. I don't think this is going to happen. I think if Mr. Trump does that, it will create inflation in the U.S., and I don't think that's what he's going to do. So I think he's going to aim at some sectors, and that will definitely be very difficult for these sectors, but it won't create a recession in Canada. I think what is going to limit Mr. Trump is not, unfortunately, it's not the action that Canada is going to take, because we are a small player. We represent only 10% of the size of the U.S. economy. I think what is going to limit Mr. Trump is the market. And already U.S. bond interest rate has been increasing just because of the uncertainty around tariff. So imposing tariff massively on both Canada and Mexico will create a reaction on the market that I think Mr. Trump will listen to. So that's why, as an economist, I would be extremely surprised if we're hit with 25% tariff everywhere. I think he's going to choose some sector, and he's going to ask for the renegotiation of the free trade agreement.
JP, do your customers in the U.S. know that tariffs could potentially happen? And are they doing anything?
Half our customers in the United States don't even realize that we're in a different country.
Right.
You know, I remember years ago, and we were, okay, this is when, you know, they'd put the check in the mail, and they would put the stamp for the amount that you would put to send to anywhere in the United States. They didn't put enough money, and that's why we didn't get paid on time, because they didn't realize we were in Canada and it was a different country. So the other thing they don't realize, because, and this is the currency aspect, we price everybody in US dollars. Canadian dollar moves, sometimes it moves in our favor, sometimes it moves against us. They never, when it was moving in our favor, they never came and asked for a part of it. They didn't, because they just don't realize that that we're really in a different country. So it's not their problem, it's going to be our problem. That's the point that I make here, because we when you look at how tariffs are applied, we we ship the product to the States, we clear the product in the States, we would be responsible for paying the 25% tariff right then and there. And therefore, we have to decide as we price our product, do we pass on that 25%? Do we eat the whole thing or do something in the middle there? That's our decision because it's not, that's how that's going to go. We will be the importer of record from that point of view. And so, you know, we have to deal with that type of thing. There's ways that you can minimize that. You can set up a company in the United States. We have a company in the United States that will do the marketing of it. And so we can transfer the product across the border at a lower cost than a fully costed product and then sell it from the United States. So you can do these types of things to mitigate the impact of the amount of money that you're going to pay as a tariff, but you're still going to have that. And of course, like I indicated, we can move product from different countries into the United States, so to avoid that tariff along those lines in there. So, you know, it was interesting because you asked about what are the reactions of the American customers in there, and I just spent the last week in Europe, and you know we have our accent, of course, that we have as we're walking around Europe, and people would say, "Are you American?" "No, I'm Canadian," and then every single person said, "Oh, you're going to be the 51st state." Oh, it was really annoying, okay, because it was like over and over and over again. It's like, you know, so it's not just here in Canada that we're hearing that. Everybody's hearing exactly what's going on in there. So there's that kind of thing in there. Whereas when you look at the reactions in the States, it's a lot more insular.
So Bob, he's not saying that Mexico should become the 52nd state. Are we just more desirable than Mexico? Or you know, why is Mexico getting off a little lighter than Canada right this minute?
Well, in terms of the 51st state, I think there's just a fantastic level of racism coming out of Trump that says, Canada, we'll take you, but not anyone in Latin America. They're very open about that, and it's really, really disheartening. So in terms of what Mexico is going to expect, in terms of their relations with the U.S., is the tariffs will likely be harder hitting on sort of secondary areas of Mexico. So the automotive industry has a lot of invisible border action between the two countries. Same with beef, right? Cows go all the way up from, you know, Sonoma all the way up to Alberta and somehow wind up in Wyoming by the end of it. So maybe those two areas less so, but other things that Mexico is providing into the U.S., we could probably see that. And again, that would also echo into other countries in Latin America. The one thing that anytime Trump talks about Mexico is the border. And the costs involved and trying to isolate Mexico from the U.S. through a border wall. The U.S. is struggling, and they've struggled to try to keep their expectations of border security within budget and reason with Mexico since Trump's first term. Simply put, they can't afford the expectations that they're proposing. So that's another element to consider in terms of what they're planning to do in the future there. But ultimately, I think we're going to see Mexico already start to open up to other economies, notably China. Right?
Sorry, you were fast on that. It will be China?
China.
Yeah.
So we've seen Colombia make the statement, say we're open to business for anyone. Peru has said we welcome China, and Mexico will also start to open up in that way. The big sort of long game things I think that the U.S. would be curious to get better market access in Canada would actually be telecoms and communications. I think that's somewhere in the target that there's been enough murmuring that American companies want access to the telecom markets in Canada. That's probably one area for sure that I don't see them discussing on the Mexican side.
Pierre, I'm going to come to you. So you raise a good point. You raise telecoms, Bob. I'm going to go to Pierre, and we didn't prepare this as a question, but supply management boards, interprovincial trade barriers. So, you know, I mean, there's great cheese in Quebec, but they don't want to have anybody else's cheese. So, you know, how does that work? Is there an opportunity for Canada to improve their economic condition by removing interprovincial trade barriers? Is that something that you could see on the horizon? And how could supply management boards impact that? And the reason I'm asking this is because I personally believe that that's one of the things the U.S. is going to come after. So anyway, over to you.
Well, it's two different questions. The first one on the domestic market, I totally agree. We should have a free trade agreement inside Canada. It's we have over the years developed much more a trade north-south than east-west, and there's a reason for that. The U.S. market is huge. There's a lot of opportunities there, and also it's often closer. It's the U.S. border is closer for many provinces than for example, BC is. So, but there's a big advantage for us to drop these barriers. Government have been trying to do that for years without success. The big question in the past was job. Every province was protecting their market because of the number of jobs that, for example, manufacturing beer by province was creating jobs. The job, I believe, is not as important as in the past. We have a much better job market now. Unemployment rate has been going down in every part of the country. And with this threat from the US, I think we have a great opportunity to reduce the barriers between provinces. We should have a total free market in Canada. So I think there's a great opportunity there. On the supply side, I agree with you. I think that would be part of the negotiation. Last time Mr. Trump asked for that, we succeeded, or things didn't change. But apparently this time around is going to be much more aggressive on that. And that, as an economist, I believe that we should not protect those sectors, but of course a lot of people would disagree with me. So it's really political. It's much more political than economics. So we'll see what if Canada will have to give up on that, but will be the center of the negotiation, I believe, for Canada.
Okay, JP, back to you. Why don't you just forget about the U.S. and export somewhere else?
Well, that sounds easy. So today we export our products to 80 countries around the world, and the United States is about 20% of our market. So over many years, we've actually moved ourselves to be less dependent on the United States market. So we were quite dependent on it in the past, and today our largest customers in Brazil, for example, used to be United States. But those are the types of things that you can't do overnight. Tariffs you can slap on overnight. So if all of a sudden, for example, you say, tariffs are slapped on there, some industries can adapt more quickly. And give you a couple examples of here where you can and you can't here that are important here in Nova Scotia is lobsters. For example, if you look at lobsters, historically, I may have to be off in percentages, but maybe a third was going to the United States, and a third to Europe, and there was a third in Japan at one time. And now China's come in and taken maybe 40% of that. Well, you can start, if tariffs get slapped in the United States, you can see people start, well, let's move more over time into another market. So that's a little bit more that you can actually do those types of things. Let's move it more to Europe, find ways to do that. You might need maybe some discounting, maybe things that you have to do in order to do that, but you can get away from that. The interesting thing is if you see Maine lobster in the menus in the United States, half of those Maine lobsters are Nova Scotia lobsters. They just don't have a tag on them, right? So if they're going to want the lobsters, you're going to pay for it because 25% would go on top of that. Look at one that's more complicated is Michelin. So if you look at Michelin, okay, a large part of their production goes to the United States for the automobile market, 10 times the size of what we have here in Canada. So there's their market. For them to adjust, they're going to have to retool. That is not simple. That's a big investment. That's a very complicated. So they're in a much more difficult position And it's really, really complicated for them to be able to go and to do the types of things that's necessary to go and to say, well, let's just decide we'll take these tires and move them here and bring them in from Europe or whatever. You just can't do that simply. That takes a lot of time. And that's the challenge that you have when somebody like President Trump goes and says, I'm putting this tariff on overnight. What do you do? And of course, like I said earlier, nobody can plan for what that is because we really don't know what's going to happen. And I think, like Pierre thinks here, that it's going to be selective because it's just going to be too complicated. I mean, you know, one of the best examples is the whole automobile industry. The level of integration in the automobile industry with parts moving across the border, cars moving across the border. If all of a sudden there's a 25% tariff on that includes the automobile industry, and Canada would have to retaliate, well, that's the American consumer is going to pay for that increased cost of those vehicles. And it's going to create the inflation, you know, that Pierre talked about. That's going to happen down there. So this is the kind of stuff that hopefully somebody is getting President Trump's ear, such that it becomes targeted and not across the board.
Right. Robert, do we have to outlast Trump for 4 years and then this is never going to happen again? I mean, when Trump put tariffs on China, Biden didn't take many of them off when he came into office. I mean, could the next president, you know, do some of the same things?
Yeah, and it depends where these orders get issued. If it's just temporary executive, then the next executive can remove it. If it gets embedded into Congress in any way, now we've got a problem because you see that countries that have been tariffed, sanctioned even by the US, they're usually connected to congressional acts that date back to the 60s. For example, do you remember the chicken war in 1962? 1962 to 1967, where Germany and France said, we're going to put a 25% tariff on chickens coming from the US into Europe. The US responded by saying, all right, similar sort of tariffs on light trucks. And so to the day, that's the only automobile that's actually heavily tariffed coming into the US as a light truck, which is why you don't see light Volkswagen trucks all that much in the States. So once they get on the books, if it's in Congress, it will stay there. That's the real problem. And the way to sort of get around it, survive the next 4, and then survive after that is to try to create, I mean, the one word that keeps coming up here is uncertainty. There's so much uncertainty with sort of the architecture of Congress in the States and Trump's behavior. Put that together, that's a really risky place to do any sort of long-term investment. And it's also going to be part of our strategy to say, what can we do, business, government, banks, universities, to make more certainty in Canada so that people who are feeling nervous about any sort of long-term investments in the US say, maybe, you know, as we've just heard here, it's not the worst economic news that we're facing right now. Could we rebrand and package ourselves as a place that would encourage more international investment here, right? Strengthen ourselves up. And that seems to be the way that many countries do survive sanctions and tariffs, if we can even put those words together, is by creating certainty and stability, and then sometimes offering key elements to the issuer of the tariffs or the sanctions that they really, really do rely on.
Right.
And that's the next part.
Okay. Pierre, back to you. You know, we hear a lot about tariffs, and of course the federal government in particular has been saying, well, there will be retaliation and there will be retaliatory tariffs. I think many of the businesses I speak to are equally concerned about that because at least they understand 25% on everything. They don't understand, you know, that it's going to be a retaliatory tariff on porcelain, which could include toilets. I met with a developer yesterday and he said, I'm concerned that my toilets are going to go up as I put up my apartment building. So, you know, it's across the board. What advice would you be giving the federal government, maybe you are, on what to do in retaliatory tariffs?
You're perfectly right. Actually, many businesses are going to be more impacted by the tariff imposed by Canada than the United States, because a lot of Canadian business are importing. My understanding, talking to the people at the federal level, is they are looking at imposing tariffs that will have the toughest impact on the U.S., but the minimal impact on Canadian business. So they're not going to respond tariff for tariff. They are going to choose different tariff to have. Somebody said before, we should focus on states that they are that we are a client for them. So that's what they are looking for. They're looking for imposing tariff that will hurt the U.S. Side, but it will be minimal for Canada. Having said that, I think Canadian business will be impacted. They all already impacted by the Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar lost 7% over the last 4 months. And if you are an exporter, that's good. If you are importing something, well, you are already impacted by, but what's going on right now. So I don't have the list of what the Fed is going to do, but they are trying to minimize the impact on Canadian businesses.
Okay. Robert, what would you say, I guess, to the Canadian government, at this point about tariffs and how we should negotiate with the United States?
Ooh, if I had that audience. All right. I think you have to start at the big picture and to say that in a response, if it's going to be tat for tat tariffs or if it's going to be political responses, will these responses be implemented through the rules-based order that we agree with, right? That through international agreements, treaties, constitutional law, the rights and responsibilities that we're used to, do we find pathways through that? Or are we going to be prepared to start doing more radical moves that would be in a new order that we're not used to? The first one is probably the way to go, because we're good at building economic foundations here on rock, not sand, right? We see that over the long picture, that the stability that Canada offers its own businesses and investors is a massive strength. And so doubling down, reinforcing, and making that space better is the way to go. What would be really dangerous would be to start making tariff responses or policy responses in the way that Trump's doing, by ignoring existing treaties or ignoring those rules. Because when you do that, I mean, you might get some symbolic stuff like, I don't know, what could we do that would be just out of control? We could ban all US aircraft from Canadian airspace. That would disrupt everything going to Europe because most of it flies over Nova Scotia, right? That might not be the wisest thing to do because the reaction could be absolutely horrific. So we need to realize that whatever we do to try to keep it in that realm of certainty and our stability. And maybe along the way, we can do a few high-risk things that could open up new opportunities or ideas. For example, I know that at the universities right now, most universities in Canada right now are saying, where are all the students going, right? Well, back to China and India is the answer to that, because the visas all got cut, right? Well, what about something like removing international tuition for American students? Another issue upstream that most American students come out with crippling debt, right? If they even came in here and paid a lower tuition, we might find our class sizes increasing. We might even be able to exchange ideas free of reciprocity from Washington with Americans themselves, right? That's the high risk stuff, but we wouldn't do it without securing that certainty behind it. And I think by making sure that our banks are stable, making sure that our dollar becomes something that foreign investors might find attractive, and keeping the very programs and the social commitments we have to each other intact. That's the priority. We don't want to see any compromise to some of the basic social commitments that Canadians make to each other, even if we're getting bullied by the neighbors to the south.
Patrick, if I can just chime in. a
I
little
was
bit.
going to ask you, please.
Okay, well, Robert, you used a lot of logic in there, and unfortunately,
That's my downfall.
I don't think logic's got anything to do with it. You got, as I'm advising the Canadian government, you got to give Donald Trump something that he says, look, I won. Whatever it is, okay? He wants 2% in defense spending. Are we better off giving 2% in defense spending than taking these abuses on tariffs? Okay, so that's the kind of thing. So he can sit there and he says, wow, I beat them up, look what I got. But we give him something that we can live with, which is much, much better. That's the important part about this. He has to be able to show when he holds up his little big thing with his signature, that's a mess there that nobody can read, right? He has to be able to say, look how I got this for the American people, right? Now, that's the important part because it's all about his ego. So if we can do that and negotiate and give them something, because when you look at that, it goes, I'm going to put 25% tariff because the border's insecure. Doesn't even make any sense. There's no logic behind any of that, which is unfortunate because
I love logic.
Yeah.
Anyway, but if you look at the big picture, we have benefited throughout the years with this globalization of free trade. And what that really meant, it really meant that, the countries and the companies in the world that could make the best product for the best price could then come to the market with their goods in a free trade type of environment. And who wins? The global consumer. Because we're able to take our money and spend it here on this particular thing that was made in that country that ended up being the best quality or whatever quality you wanted, but you got that best thing. All of this is going to move away from that type of global free trade type of stuff. So that means the consumer is going to lose because you will pay more money, and you will pay more money for maybe not as good or quality, or if it's going to be similar quality, it'll be more. You're going to pay for that. So your money that you're going to have is not going to go as far as it used to. And that's the kind of thing that's going to slow Donald Trump down, because the more that he piles it on, the more the American consumer is going to pay. And that's the only ones he cares about is the American consumer. And he wants to be able to be seen as, look how I made things better for everybody. And that's the wrong direction. It won't work. And so I'm sure Pierre is
So
an
I'm going to
economist.
ask Pierre that
There
question.
you go.
But I'm going to take issue with what you said, because I read another economist. I mean, we should only have one economist on the panel at a time. But I read about another economist, and I'll give his name later. And his suggestion was that if the tariffs go in, actually the Canadian dollar will decline. Pierre has already mentioned that the Canadian dollar has declined. The U.S. won't end up paying 25%. So, it starts to get into big economic questions, Pierre, and I guess this is where I'm going. So if 25% tariffs were put on, could that actually improve the U.S. dollar? Could that decrease the Canadian dollar? It's not really 25%. The U.S. wins and we're all screwed.
No,
good.
a lot of economists have used the model, and we don't know how the dollar would go down. How much, we're not sure. Evaluation is around 60 or 61 cents. So that will compensate partly for the 25%. But there's no doubt that if Mr. Trump imposed 25% tariff, part of it is going to be paid by consumer. First of all, because the change in the dollar won't be enough to compensate. Also, in the many sectors, you cannot just, Americans won't be able to go somewhere else to get these products cheaper than Canada. So that's a case of aluminum, that's the case of oil, that's the case of the automotive sector. In the long run, they can readjust, but in the short run, 25% tariff will have an impact on inflation in the US. And so they won't be able to get away with that. So that's the reason I believe it doesn't make sense. And I agree with, it's always Mr. Trump doesn't always think about logic. It's not always logical in his head, but I think he understands market. And that's why I would be extremely surprised if he imposed tariff on 25% on everything, because doing that, inflation will go up in the US, and people are very sensitive to inflation.
And come back to you for a second, Pierre. Do you think that there will be a small tariff put on a few items this weekend? Or do you think April 1st is the more realistic date?
It's very hard to know. We understand that there's going to be an announcement Saturday and a bigger announcement on April 1st. It's very hard to know what is going to be the strategy. I think the strategy is to negotiate, and that's what is happening already right now. It's negotiating on the border. And a lot of action right now in Canada to demonstrate that our border is more safe, that we have invested to make our border more safe. So I think that until April 1st, there's going to be a lot of negotiation, and that will have an impact on the final tariff we will have. I think Saturday will just be a general announcement, but the real deadline is probably April 1st.
Okay. So Robert, back to you, and we're going to have to wrap up in a moment, but hasn't Trump already won though? I mean, which is okay. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. He's already won because the border will be improved. There's another $1.5 billion being spent on the border. I heard on the radio this morning on CBC that the Defense Department or someone in government is now saying that Canada will reach 2% much sooner than 2030. Which is, again, I think something that Trump wanted. So isn't he already winning? And I guess in some cases, isn't that okay?
Well, things like making sure that our borders are in line, making sure that even our visa processing system overseas isn't being worked around. These are positive things that any nation would ultimately want, and it would be great. Yes, upgrade the military capacity strategies. So that our ships aren't being held together by paint, right? That would be ideal. So all of this can work towards, and again, that's going to be important with Canada's place in Europe and NATO going forward. The thing is how these requests are being put forward, and the departure of logic from saying, I heard that Canada needs to spend more on NATO. So in whatever mental gymnastics goes through Trump's head, somehow gets qualified into 25% tariffs, talking about becoming the 51st state, all this sort of just bluster. That is such a damaging environment for international negotiations. It's really, really toxic when you have a family that's cross-border. And then, of course, it's going to be something where the decisions made in other countries are always going to be seen as response to threat. And that really puts the world order in a riskier position overall. So right. Okay. Hopefully that's not the new norm.
Okay. JP, any final thoughts?
One of the things that President Trump wants to do with these tariffs is to allow for more domestic manufacturing capacity to happen in the United States. So if you're a manufacturer and you have some excess capacity and all of a sudden there's tariffs put against your Canadian competitor, that's going to work. You'll be able to crank that up, you'll be able to compete more. It's not going to be cheaper for the American consumer because they're going to take advantage of that 25% tariff. So the challenge that he has is that if you're going to look at investing in a new manufacturing facility in the United States that you're going to amortize over 20, 25 years, are you really going to build a facility in the States based on this tariff that got slapped in such a haphazard way? You're going to wait. You're going to wait. You're not going to make those investments. So he cannot create those jobs from new manufacturing capacity until there's a confidence that this is going to be the new world order, right? And that's going to take a long time before people will have that type of confidence in that. So stay tuned.
Okay.
It's going to be interesting.
Pierre, any parting thoughts?
Well, I agree with that. And, you know, one of the issue they have is the U.S. economy is performing very well. The unemployment rate is only 4%.
Oh,
No.
That's a
Of the
parting thought.
production. So,
oh, sorry, you froze there, so you'll
oh,
have to repeat that.
okay. So, you know, I said I agree what was said, and also one of the issue that they have is the U.S. economy is performing very well. The unemployment rate is 4%. So there's no extra capacity to reshore all the production they are talking about. So I think, you know, this is a difficult situation because of his style of a negotiation. But in the long run, Canada will continue to perform, continue to have a very integrated economy with the US. I think in the long run, we'll be okay. We'll have some a bumpy road for the next 4 years.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, JP. Thank you, Bob. And Pierre, I didn't introduce you. Pierre Cleroux is the chief economist at BDC. Thank you very much for joining us from snowy Montreal today. Really appreciate it. We'll catch up with our members and with you in a few weeks to see how this is going. I want to thank the Lord Nelson Hotel for hosting us. They currently have a member-to-member offer with us, an 18% discount on your stay at the hotel. So you can stay here for a great staycation if you want to get out from the suburbs and come into the city. Stay tuned for more important discussions, lots more important discussions, because this is changing on a daily and almost weekly basis. Next Friday, we will be hosting Melanie Joly, the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs, live and in person. Actually live and in person right here on this stage. So Melanie will be here, or Minister Joly will be here next week. She met with Marco Rubio yesterday. I expect she'll have more meetings between now and next Friday. It will be good to understand what she's thinking and what the Canadian government is thinking. And I hope it is a small announcement tomorrow. I will just recommend, and Pierre can tell me that it's a bad idea to look at this, but there is a gentleman named Stephen Marin, M-I-R-A-N, who is the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And he writes about how great tariffs are. And sadly, he's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. So, you know, you may just want to take a peek at some of the writing that he's done over the last little while, because it articulates quite clearly what their expectations are. And their expectations are small tariffs at the beginning, bigger tariffs later, or certainly his are, and then to achieve your goals without actually implementing the tariffs, hence border security and increased defense spending in Canada. So it's kind of a good read. Take a look at it. Thank you all for joining us today. Really pleased to see you all here. I hope you gained some valuable information. I know I certainly did. This is a changing story, and we will try to keep all of you updated as much as we can. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre.